The scariest stories are whispered, not told.
I should have listened to my gut about the clock. When we first stepped into the old house, it felt empty. Not just vacant, empty, in a way that made you lower your voice without knowing why. Dust hung in the air, the floorboards creaked like a complaint under every step, and the smell of something faintly sweet and old clung to the walls. But there was one thing that wasn't empty: the grandfather clock. It stood at the far end of the hallway, just outside what would eventually be our bedroom, like a quiet sentry. We didn't even notice it at first. The realtor kept gushing about the hardwood floors and the vintage charm of the place while we wandered through. My wife Julia was already imagining paint colors, curtains, and rugs. But then, as we walked upstairs, I heard it, a faint mechanical hum. I turned, and there it was, tall and dark, its brass pendulum swinging lazily behind glass. The wood was polished and gleamed faintly, even in the dusty light. I don't know why, but seeing it there made me shiver. We bought the house anyway. Julia said it was perfect, just the kind of blank canvas we'd been looking for. We moved in that weekend, with nothing but a mattress on the floor and a few boxes stacked in the corner. But the clock stayed. When I asked the realtor about it, she just shrugged and said it was too heavy to move, and the previous owners wanted it to stay with the house. She said it like she was quoting them exactly. The first night, I didn't sleep well. Even though the house was silent and Julia was breathing softly beside me, I kept half waking every hour. And then at 1 a.m. exactly, it struck. Just one low, deep gong. It echoed down the hall and into the bedroom, like it was coming from somewhere much further away. Julia stirred beside me. "Guess we need to figure out how to shut that thing off," she murmured groggily before rolling over. But neither of us got up. Not that night. The next morning, over coffee, I said, "We should really take that clock down." Julia nodded distractedly, scrolling through her phone. But we didn't. The second night, the same thing. The faint mechanical whir of gears winding tighter as the hour approached. And then that deep, resonant gong. Just once. I sat up in bed, heart racing, but Julia just pulled the blanket tighter around her and mumbled, "We really should take it down," before falling back asleep. But neither of us moved. And so it went, night after night. That same single gong at 1 a.m., never a minute early, never a minute late. Sometimes we'd talk about it over breakfast, laugh nervously and say we'd take it down, that we'd get to it that weekend, that it was just one more thing on the list. But we never did. I don't know why. A month went by. By then we'd hung pictures, put down rugs, bought a proper bed frame. The house was starting to feel like ours, but the clock never let me forget. Even when I wasn't awake to hear it, I dreamed of that sound. The low, vibrating gong that seemed to hum in my bones. Some nights I woke already sitting up, like I'd been waiting for it. Sometimes I thought I heard faint whispers from the hallway after it rang. But when I strained to listen, the house was quiet again. Julia started to look tired. "I didn't sleep well last night," she said over breakfast one morning. "Me neither," I said. She nodded. Then she added, almost as an afterthought, "We should really get rid of that thing." But her voice sounded flat, resigned, like she already knew we wouldn't. One night I got up around midnight and walked quietly into the hallway. The clock stood there, its pendulum swinging slowly, ticking softly. I crouched in front of it and peered at the face. Its brass hands glowed faintly in the dark, and the second hand ticked steadily toward the top of the hour. I reached out and grabbed the edge of the cabinet and stopped, because something moved. In the glass just behind my own reflection, I thought I saw another face. Thin, gray, smiling faintly. I stumbled back. Julia's voice called softly from the bedroom. "Come back to bed." I did, but I couldn't close my eyes. That week I started to notice other things, shadows in the corner of my eye that disappeared when I turned my head. Faint footsteps creaking across the floor above us, even though we were the only ones home. And always that clock, at 1 a.m. sharp. I stopped talking about it. So did Julia. We just endured it until the night I finally had enough. It was a Thursday. I went to bed earlier than usual, already tense, waiting for it. When the first faint click of gears winding tighter reached my ears, I sat up. And when the hands ticked past midnight, my heart started to race. When the gong struck at exactly 1 a.m., I was already halfway out of bed. The sound seemed louder this time, deeper. I walked into the hallway and froze. The house had changed. The rugs, the paint, the pictures on the walls, gone. Instead, the wallpaper was peeling and stained. The light fixtures were old and yellowed, and the air smelled of dust and something faintly sweet and rotting. At the end of the hallway, the clock glowed faintly in the darkness, its pendulum swinging faster now. And beyond it, the living room was full. They were sitting around a table in the center of the room. People I didn't recognize, gray-skinned, thin, their clothes faded and torn. They all turned to look at me at once, their eyes dark and hollow. One of them smiled and said in a voice that was almost a whisper, "Finally, our new guest has come." On the table in front of them lay a Ouija board. Its planchette was already moving, spelling something out in slow, deliberate circles. And as I stood frozen in the doorway, the walls around me seemed to shift and groan, the air growing colder, thicker. One of the figures gestured to the chair across from them. "Sit," they murmured. The clock ticked loudly in the silence, and when I glanced back toward the hallway, Julia stood there in the shadows, watching me with wide, unblinking eyes, smiling faintly. I still don't know if I sat down, or if I ran, or if I've been sitting there ever since. But every night, at exactly 1 a.m., I hear the gong, and I feel them watching me, waiting. I never wanted this assignment. When the Archdiocese called me into the office one rainy Tuesday morning, I thought it was just another routine parish transfer. The secretary, a kind woman named Miriam, wouldn't meet my eyes as she ushered me in. The Vicar General, Monsignor Delacroix, sat behind his vast oak desk, steepling his fingers. "Father Michael," he said, "I assume you're aware of the irregularities at St. Jude's." I nodded cautiously. Everyone was aware of St. Jude's, a crumbling church on the edge of town, the kind of place priests were quietly shuffled to when they'd been worn down, burned out, or otherwise fallen out of favor. But the current priest, Father Kellen, had developed a reputation, even by St. Jude's standards. There were whispers, unapproved rites, unrecorded exorcisms, people visiting at odd hours and leaving visibly shaken. Some called him a miracle worker, others called him a fanatic. "We need someone to look into it," Delacroix said finally. He slid a thin folder across the desk toward me, and that was how I found myself assigned to investigate a fellow priest. to find out what Father Kellen was really doing behind the locked doors of St. Jude's. The first time I saw the church, I almost turned back. It was smaller than I'd imagined, its stone facade cracked and weathered, its bell tower leaning slightly like an old man. The front doors were open, though, and the air inside was heavy with incense and something else, something faintly metallic. I remember thinking it smelled like blood. Father Kellen was waiting for me at the altar. He was taller than I expected, with sharp cheekbones and sunken eyes that seemed to drink in every detail. His smile widened just slightly. "Exorcisms," he said almost to himself. "The church has forgotten what they really are." I didn't know what to say to that. But even then, part of me wanted to leave, and part of me already knew I wouldn't. The first few nights, I stayed in the rectory. It was cold and quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavy. The parishioners I met during the day were polite, even warm, but when I mentioned Father Kellen, they'd all fall silent, their faces clouding with something I couldn't name. I began attending his evening masses, and that's when I first saw it. The people who came weren't regular parishioners. They came alone, slipping in through the side door, sitting at the very back. Their clothes were plain, their faces pale, their eyes fixed on the floor. And when Mass ended, they stayed seated, until Father Kellen would turn, his voice dropping, and say, "Those who wish to be free, remain." That first night, I stayed too, and that was when I heard it. A sound like nothing I'd heard before, a guttural, inhuman growl from the back pew. When I turned, a woman was writhing on the floor, her eyes rolled back, her mouth foaming. Father Kellen didn't flinch. He stepped down from the altar, knelt beside her, and pressed his hand to her forehead. "The old prayers," he murmured. "That's what they fear." The growling turned into a scream that shook the walls, and then silence. When it was over, he stood and helped the woman to her feet. She wept into his chest, thanking him over and over, and he just smiled faintly, patting her shoulder. When he caught me staring, he only said, "Not everything needs to be written down." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking of the way the woman's voice had changed, how it sounded more like an animal than a person, and how, for just a moment, I thought I'd seen something move behind her eyes. Over the next week, I watched him work, and each time, I was sure I'd finally see him slip, finally catch him breaking some sacred rule, crossing some forbidden line. But he didn't. His prayers were flawless, his Latin perfect. But there was something else, something deeper, like he wasn't just casting something out, like he was inviting something in. One night, long after midnight, I heard him in the sanctuary. I crept down the hall, my bare feet silent on the cold stone floor, and peered through the crack in the door. And what I saw, the pews were full, but not with parishioners. Their faces were gray and sunken, their eyes black and hollow. And Father Kellen stood at the altar, arms outstretched, chanting words I didn't recognize. The next day, I confronted him. "What are you doing here?" I demanded. He only smiled. "I'm doing what the church won't," he said softly. His eyes glinted in the half-light. "I'm giving them a place to go." I didn't understand. He sighed and leaned back in his chair. The church fears what it doesn't understand. But the possessed, the lost, they need a shepherd too. Someone to listen, someone to keep them. That night, I packed my bags. I was ready to leave. But as I passed the sanctuary one last time, I couldn't help myself. I pushed the door open and froze. The pews were full again, but now they all turned to look at me, their black eyes glinting in the candle light. And at the altar, Father Kellen stood over a Ouija board, his hands resting lightly on the planchette. When he saw me, he smiled, and in a voice that was both his and not his, he said, "Finally, our new guest has come." I don't remember what happened after that, only that now, every night, I feel them watching me, waiting. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still hear his voice. Not everything needs to be written down.